The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The notebook had 47 pages of notes in it by the time the battle ended. Not on what had happened, on what needed to happen next. Hermione Granger had begun writing at 2 a.m, while the castle was still on fire and curses were still lighting up the corridors and flashes of green and red through the windows. She had not stopped, not in the chaos before dawn, not in the long gray morning after, not while the bodies were being moved from the Great Hall, or while Molly Weasley sat at the far end with George's head in her lap, or while Kingsley Shacklebolt and Professor McGonagall spoke in the antechamber in the quiet, terrible tones of people determining what comes next. 47 pages. The Ministry would fracture within 6 weeks if nobody addressed the power vacuum before it hardened into a new one. The Wizengamot seats held through intimidation had legal grounds for challenge. She had written out the relevant statute from memory. The Gringotts treaties suspended during the occupation needed formal reinstatement, or the bank would invoke its sovereign default clause before September. The Muggle-born Registration Commission's records had to be preserved as evidence before anyone with an interest in their disappearance realized no one was currently guarding them. Harry had found her at the window and read the first page over her shoulder without asking permission. "When did you start this?" he'd said. "During the battle." He'd looked at her. "I couldn't stop thinking," she'd said. "So I wrote it down." A pause. Then, "That's not a flaw." She'd met his gaze with the expression she wore when she had expected a different response and was quietly revising her position. "No," she'd said after a moment. "I suppose it isn't." 3 days later, they sat across an obsidian table from Director Ragnarok of Gringotts, 4 folders arranged between them, each bound in a different color of ribbon, each compiled not over weeks but over months, added to while their author hid in tents and forests and borrowed minutes of silence when silence was dangerous. The keeper of the lineage records had not visibly moved in 40 minutes. Ragnarok's senior legal officer had leaned forward by exactly 3 centimeters at the second proposal and had not moved since. Ragnarok looked at them both for a long moment. Then he said, with the tone of someone arriving at a conclusion he had been building toward across the entire meeting, "You are 17 and 18 years old." Hermione did not hesitate. "Yes, both of you walked into this room carrying proposals that 4 separate ministry legal departments collectively failed to produce across 2 centuries. You presented them in logical sequence as a unified system. You identified Gringotts' institutional interest in each component, with a precision suggesting either an extensive familiarity with our internal governance documents or a natural instinct for the structure of our priorities." He let the silence sit between them. "Which is it?" "Both," Hermione said. Ragnarok looked at Harry Potter, 17 years old, dark-haired, carrying a scar that had stopped hurting 3 days ago for the first time in his life, and something moved through the goblin's expression, not surprise, but the specific gravity of confirmation. He looked at the folders in their sequence on the obsidian surface. He rose. "Leave the folders." 3 days for legal review. A pause at the door. "Mr. Potter, the dragon situation remains unresolved. Its extraction, care, and attitude adjustment will appear in your next statement." "Understood," Harry said. The door closed. Hermione had the notebook open before the room finished settling. "He's going to say yes," she said without looking up. "I know," Harry said. "The dragon accounting is going to be significant. Also know that." She looked up briefly, the expression she wore when something had gone exactly as planned and she was already past it, focused on what came next. 3 down, she said. 11 to go. She went back to writing. To understand what 3 days had built, you had to go back to the morning that had made it necessary. The Great Hall of Hogwarts, on the first morning after the war, smelled of copper and ash. More than 50 people were dead. Harry stood at the hall's center with a cup of cold tea, and kept redirecting his gaze away from the floor where Fred Weasley had been. The bodies had been moved before dawn. Fred, Lavender Brown, Colin Creevey, and others whose faces kept arriving in his peripheral vision when he tried to focus on something else. The long tables were pushed against the walls. Someone had opened the enchanted ceiling, and the May morning it showed was the flat, undecided gray of a day that hadn't yet committed to anything. Molly Weasley sat 20 feet away with George's head in her lap, her hand moving through his hair in a rhythm that belonged to a language older than words. George lay with his eyes open, watching the ceiling with an expression Harry could not name. Not grief exactly. Something beneath grief. The expression of someone discovering that loss contained dimensions language hadn't prepared them for. Behind them, Percy Weasley sat against the stone wall with his arms around his knees, watching his mother's hand move and not blinking. He had not spoken since 4 a.m. Nobody required him to. Ron had gone to find hot tea 30 minutes ago and returned with 2 cups still warm, which was against the odds and entirely characteristic. He put one in Molly's hands. He sat on the floor beside George with the other. The 3 of them made a shape that was both complete and broken, which was the only shape the morning offered. Kingsley Shacklebolt stood at the antechamber door, speaking quietly with McGonagall. He had fought through the night alongside all of them, had held the Great Hall entrance for nearly an hour at the worst of it, and had spent the hours since summoning 12 additional Aurors from the Ministry and invoking an ICW observer status that produced, each time he deployed it, a particular expression in the remaining Death Eaters, the expression of people encountering a system they had not prepared for. McGonagall's face, turned toward Kingsley, carried the weight of a woman who had spent 3 decades watching children pass through her school and was now counting which of them had not come home. Hermione stood at the far window. She had been there 45 minutes, a notebook open in her left hand, quill unmoving in her right, looking down at the scorched grounds. The Whomping Willow had lost 2 branches. The greenhouses stood completely intact, which struck Harry as wrong somehow, that something so ordinary had survived untouched when so much had not. He crossed the hall and stood beside her. "I've been making a list," she said, without turning. "I know. Not of what happened." She looked at the notebook. "Of what hasn't happened yet. What needs to happen. What will collapse in the next 6 months if nobody addresses it." She turned to him. Finally, her eyes were dry, not the absence of grief, but grief that had made a deliberate decision about itself, for now. The Ministry will reconstitute around whoever is available. Most of the people available are compromised. Wizengamot seats held through intimidation have legal grounds for challenge. The Gringotts treaties were suspended during the occupation. The Muggle-born Registration Commission needs to be dismantled, but its records must be preserved as evidence first, in the right sequence. "Kingsley," Harry said, "is the right person for minister. Getting him there permanently is a separate problem." She paused. "I made this list at 2 a.m. while the battle was still happening." Harry looked at her. "I know," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something eventually." She closed the notebook, not with frustration, with the precise care of someone containing something they intend to return to. "I couldn't stop thinking. So I wrote it down." "That's not a flaw," Harry said. She met his gaze with the expression she wore when she had expected a different response and was updating her position. "No," she said, after a moment. "I suppose it isn't." The thing they had not yet said to each other was circling them both. They had survived. The particularity of it, that Harry was standing in the Great Hall at Hogwarts on the first morning of a world without Voldemort, was something requiring time to become real, and the time was arriving in increments. Each breath made it slightly more so. Hermione said, quietly, "What are we going to do?" Not the question it sounded like. She didn't mean today, or about the bodies, or about Kingsley. She meant the version underneath all of it, the long version, beneath the notebook and the list and the 9 months of running that had felt like 9 years. "I don't know yet," Harry said. "That's unusual." Something moved across her face. "I think it matters what we do next. Not in the abstract. Specifically, right now, this morning. We are in a position we will never occupy again. The system that failed is broken open. There is a window." She held his gaze. "Windows close. What would we do?" he said. "If we were going to do something." She looked at the notebook in her hand. "Rebuild it," she said. "Not restore it, rebuild it. From the legal architecture outward, not alone, but as the initiating force, before it calcifies back into what it was." She said it in the register she used when she had been thinking about something for a very long time, and was discovering that saying it aloud was different from thinking it in ways she hadn't anticipated. He turned from the window and looked at her directly, the quality of attention that meant he was not managing anything. Not performing steadiness, simply present. "If we do this," he said, "we can't stop in the middle. 3 years in, we can't decide it's too much and walk away. I know, people will resist. The ones who benefited from the old structures. I know. And we'll be wrong about things. We'll make mistakes we won't recognize as mistakes until they've already happened." "Harry," she said, with the patience of someone who had examined a problem from every angle and was not going to be unsettled by the obvious ones. "All of that is true. The alternative is going home and leaving it to reconstitute itself." She held his gaze. "I've seen what it reconstitutes into." He was quiet. The hall breathed around them, open ceiling, gray sky, more than 50 dead. The living bent over their grief at the far end, the morning arriving whether it was wanted or not. He held out his right hand, palm up, in the space between them. Not a handshake. Not a ceremony. Two people who had been making decisions together since they were 11 years old, standing in the wreckage of a war they had survived, choosing the next thing. She looked at his hand. She put hers in it. Outside, the sky decided. It cleared, not completely because Scotland in May never did anything completely, but enough. Ordinary light fell through the open ceiling in a long rectangle across the floor. And it was enough. 3 days later, Harry and Hermione climbed the marble steps of Gringotts with Kingsley Shacklebolt behind them, the repair to the doors still visible in the brightness of new metal against centuries of darkened bronze. The goblins at the entrance were more numerous than usual, watching with precision rather than ceremony. 2 of them, on recognizing Harry, exchanged a look whose content he could not read, but whose existence he registered. Hermione walked beside him with the leather satchel that had survived 9 months of fugitive living, with the indestructibility of something both carefully charmed and used constantly. Heavier than it looked. Always heavier than it looked. Kingsley had been confirmed as interim minister 48 hours earlier, with a speed suggesting the ICW had been preparing for precisely this moment. He had agreed to this meeting without requiring much persuasion, which Harry took as either genuine alignment or the intelligence of a politician who recognized where the momentum was. He chose to believe the first interpretation. Hermione had not committed to either. The founder's suite was not designed for human comfort. The table was obsidian dark and long. Ragnarok sat at its head, flanked by his senior legal officer and the keeper of the lineage records, a goblin whose age expressed itself not in visible years, but in the gravity he carried, the settled weight of someone who had seen enough of everything to no longer be surprised by most of it. Hermione placed the satchel on the table and extracted 4 folders without preamble. The first was bound in deep blue ribbon. "The Gringotts Sovereignty Compact," she said. "Formalized autonomous status under ICW primary charter, removing the bank from ministry oversight entirely in exchange for specific enumerated obligations, including enforcement authority over Wizengamot decisions, involving asset claims, inheritance disputes, and unlawful detention." She set a single page before Ragnarok. Any case of unlawful detention would require Gringotts confirmation before ministry enforcement could proceed. Ragnar read without visible reaction. His legal officer leaned forward by 3 centimeters, which was more movement than Harry had observed from him in 30 minutes. "You are proposing," Ragnar said carefully, "that Gringotts hold enforcement authority over specific Wizengamot decisions." "Sirius Black served 12 years in Azkaban without trial," Hermione said. "Never convicted. His accounts were frozen illegally for over a decade, which, under existing Gringotts sovereignty protocols, constitutes lineage theft the bank was never compensated for." She met the goblin's gaze without blinking. "We are offering a mechanism that prevents this from happening again. In exchange, the bank gains sovereign status that removes it from political interference permanently." The silence had the texture of a negotiation in which one party had arrived with something the other wanted more than they intended to reveal. "The second proposal," Ragnar said. The second folder was Hermione's most detailed work. 40% of current Wizengamot seats held by families with documented Death Eater involvement, each forfeiture grounded in existing law. The proceedings designed to be legally unassailable before they began. "This is where the Ministry's role is essential," she said, looking at Kingsley. "If the aristocratic families resist and apply pressure to drop the proceedings, the Gringotts Compact's enforcement authority makes that pressure ineffective. The 2 proposals reinforce each other structurally." "The third," Ragnar said. The third folder was Harry's. Not drafted from her notes, his own structure, direct where hers was precise. He had stayed up until 3 in the morning writing it, and she had read it the next day and revised exactly 4 things and declared it structurally sound. "The Magical Creature Rights Charter," Harry said. "Goblins, house elves, centaurs, merpeople, werewolves. The existing framework treats all of these populations as assets, hazards, or anomalies depending on the political moment. The charter creates a legal status that is not human citizenship, but is not less than it. Rights that cannot be removed by Wizengamot vote, with Gringotts holding enforcement authority under the compact." Something shifted in Ragnar's expression, not surprise, something more like recognition. "You wrote this," he said. "Yes, not Miss Granger. She revised 4 things." "Which 4? Harry named them. Ragnar listened to each one with the attention of someone conducting a private assessment, then looked at the keeper of the lineage records, who made a small, deliberate movement of acknowledgement. "The 4th. Hermione spoke for 12 minutes on the 4th proposal without consulting a single note. Magical education in Britain, its systematic failure of Muggle-born students, its complete absence of any curriculum addressing the history of creature oppression, its production of graduates who could cast a Patronus, but had no framework for understanding why the society they returned to was constructed as it was. "We are not proposing that Hogwarts be closed," she said. "We are proposing that the curriculum be subject to an external review body with authority to mandate inclusion of content that has been omitted for political reasons. History of magic as currently taught is not history. It is a selective narrative. The omissions are not accidental." Ragnar looked at all 4 folders arranged before him in sequence. "You are 17 and 18 years old," he said. "Yes," Hermione said. He looked at Harry, at Hermione, at Kingsley, then back at the folders. "You have identified Gringotts' institutional interest in each of these, with a precision suggesting either an extensive familiarity with our internal governance documents or a natural instinct for the structure of our priorities." He paused. "I asked which. You said both. Having reviewed what you have placed before me, I believe you." He rose. "Leave the folders. 3 days." He looked at Harry once more. "The dragon accounting will be significant. I anticipated that," Harry said. "Good," Ragnar said. "Because the animal has opinions about the reserve staff, and they have invoiced us for the resulting damages." After he left, Hermione was already writing before the door had fully closed. The 3 days Ragnar had requested stretched into 4, then 5. On the 6th morning, a letter arrived at Grimmauld Place, bearing the Gringotts seal, formal, brief and entirely in Ragnar's handwriting. It said yes, all 4 proposals, with 7 amendments, each enumerated with goblin legal precision, and each of which, Hermione determined after reading the amendments 3 times, actually improved the proposals rather than weakened them. She read the letter aloud to Harry at the kitchen table at 7:30 in the morning, then read it silently to herself, then set it down. 7 amendments, she said. And he accepted the whole framework. Yes, she looked at the letter. 2 of the amendments I should have thought of myself. Harry said, "You did think of them. They're in the version you showed me before the meeting." She picked up the letter again. The language in Amendment 4 is more precise than mine. The language in Amendment 4 is less precise than yours. It's more diplomatically functional. She looked at him. Those are different things. Yes, he said. That's why it's an amendment and not a correction. She did not argue with this, which was its own form of agreement. She opened her notebook and began drafting the response, and Harry made tea, and the morning light came through the kitchen window at Grimmauld Place with the ordinary brightness of a day that had decided to be good. Ron arrived at 9 with the news that the Daily Prophet had run a front page on Kingsley's confirmation, a cautious piece that managed to simultaneously endorse the new minister, express reservations about the speed of the process, and include a photograph of Harry at the ministry that Harry had not known was being taken. Luna Lovegood's Quibbler had run a different front page. The Rebuilding Begins, an optimistic overview of everything that could still go wrong, which was both alarming and, on close reading, broadly accurate. She's included a diagram, Ron said, spreading the Quibbler across the kitchen table. It's a chart of interconnected reform initiatives. She's labeled yours the spine. Harry's is the heart. The Gringotts Compact is the muscle. Hermione leaned over to look at it. "What's the ministry labeled?" she asked. Ron said, "She's labeled it the stomach, which has been eating itself for years but has recently agreed to stop." Harry looked at the diagram for a long moment. "That's actually correct," he said. 1 month after the battle, the Wizengamot chamber showed 350 years of unchanged purpose in the stone of its walls. The horseshoe configuration, the black-robed members arranged by seniority, the fountain of magical brethren at the entrance, a central wizard figure taller than everything around him, attended by centaur and goblin and house elf in postures that were technically reverential and structurally submissive. Harry stood before the fountain and thought about what Hermione had said over dinner at Grimmauld Place 3 weeks earlier. It's a political statement cast in bronze that nobody has questioned because they've been looking at it since childhood. She was right. She was usually right about things like this. Lucius Malfoy's seat was empty. So were 7 others. The gallery was full, every member present, which only happened when something consequential was coming, and everyone wanted to be seen on the right side of it. The murmuring at the room's edges carried the register of people who had decided that performing composure was preferable to displaying what they actually felt. Augusta Longbottom sat bolt upright in the 4th seat of the left bench, watching the chamber with the alertness of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and believed they had arrived inside it. Percy Weasley occupied a chair in the ministry officials section behind a stack of procedural documents he had prepared at Hermione's request. He had not been asked to speak. He had been asked to have the right document available the instant it was needed, a form of usefulness that he performed with quiet competence, understanding without anyone stating it that this was also a form of penance, and that penance done well still counted for something. Hermione opened the proceedings. The Wizengamot is in receipt of 43 forfeiture petitions filed under Section 17 of the Magical Governance Act, the provision governing seat forfeiture in cases of criminal conduct. She placed the documentation on the central podium with deliberate care. The petitions have been reviewed by the Gringotts Legal Office, which confirms their compliance with statute. They are supported by documentation from the Ministry Archive of Unforgivable Curse Prosecutions, the Azkaban Record of Inmate Confessions, and a second document, set beside the first, the Gringotts lineage theft database, cross-referenced against asset records of all currently seated members. Barnabas Cuffey challenged the admissibility of the Gringotts database before she finished her sentence. She directed him to Appendix C. He sat back down. Harry spoke once, in the first hour. He had prepared very little of what he said, because he had discovered over the preceding weeks that his most effective register was the one that arrived without performance. "This is not a purge," he said. "It is a legal proceeding. Each petition is supported by specific documented conduct under specific existing law. We are not creating new categories to catch people who were previously uncatchable. We are applying the law that exists to the evidence that exists." He looked across the chamber without heat. If anyone believes they have been wrongly included, the appeals process is in Appendix F. 3 stages, independent review, no one excluded from due process. He paused. What I want understood is that if these proceedings are obstructed through mechanisms everyone in this room knows are being used in bad faith, the Gringotts Compact's enforcement provisions transfer jurisdiction to an ICW tribunal. The ICEB does not operate on ministry timelines. I recommend the first option. The chamber received this with the silence of an institution being told something it already knew. The admissibility vote passed 41 to 16. The 16 against being, without exception, members on the petition list, which Hermione noted in her notebook as a self-identification mechanism she had anticipated and would cite in the appeals process. Augusta Longbottom rose during the afternoon session on the reconstitution proposal without being on the speakers list. Session Chair Arabella Fitch, 15 years in the role, the most technically precise person present, granted the accommodation without hesitation. "The Longbottom family has held its seat for 200 years, Augusta said. "We have served with reasonable distinction. We have also consistently supported measures that would have prevented the circumstances requiring this session. Those measures were consistently voted down." She looked at Hermione steadily. "I would like to be on the correct side of this one." The reconstitution proposal passed 53 to 11. Hereditary seats reduced to 30%. The remaining 70% elected. Through a franchise including all magical persons over 17 with 2 years of documented British residence, which, for the first time in Wizarding Britain's recorded history, included centaurs, merpeople, and goblins as enfranchised participants. When this element was read aloud, the chamber produced the institutional equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Then it voted anyway. Percy had the correct documentation ready before anyone asked for it. On the way out of the chamber 3 hours later, Harry stopped beside him in the corridor. "The lineage theft cross-reference in Appendix C," Harry said. "You added a footnote clarifying the admissibility scope. That was yours?" Percy looked at him. "Yes, I noticed the original language was technically ambiguous in cases involving indirect asset transfer. I added 2 sentences of clarification overnight. It was what stopped Cuff's challenge." Percy said nothing, which was a different thing from having nothing to say. Harry said, "The ministry works when the people in it do the work it requires. You did the work it required today." It was the most direct thing either of them had said to the other, and they both knew it. Percy looked at the procedural documents in his hands. Then he said, "I know what I did. I know what it cost." He met Harry's gaze without deflection. "I am aware that knowing is not the same as having undone it." "No," Harry said, "it isn't, but it's where making it count has to start." Percy nodded once, with the precise movements of someone who had thought carefully about the distinction between being forgiven and being useful, and had decided to pursue the second regardless of the first. He went back to his documents. Harry went back to Hermione, who was already in the next corridor, already writing. 3 weeks after the Wizengamot session, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes reopened on Diagon Alley. Harry hadn't been certain it would happen so soon. He'd privately wondered whether the sign might stay dark for months, that George might need that long and more, and that nobody would say anything about it if he did. But on a Tuesday morning in the height of that summer, the purple facade blazed back to life, pygmy puffs in the window, extendable ears in their rack, the whole impossible, beloved, irreplaceable thing back at its corner of the alley, as if it had simply been waiting to be allowed to exist again. Above the door, a new placard, under new management. Harry stood outside with Hermione and Ron. Ron made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else. Hermione stood very still for a moment, and then took a breath. George opened the door himself. He looked at the three of them on the pavement, with the expression he had been wearing since May. The expression of someone who had lost something so fundamental that their face had to rebuild its relationship to ordinary emotion from the beginning, one day at a time. His gaze moved across each of them, assessing, and then something in it steadied. "You coming in?" he said, "or just going to stand there being supportive?" They went in. The shop was exactly as it had been, which was also completely different, because the person who had built it with Fred Weasley now stood behind its counter alone and was choosing to make it run anyway. George walked them through every product that had been in development when the war stopped everything. Self-writing sympathy cards that chose their own messages based on the sender's handwriting pressure, a new generation of decoy detonators smaller than a galleon. "Fred's last design," George said, holding one up between two fingers. "I improved it by 12%, and he would absolutely dispute that." He said this with his face arranged in something approaching a smile and his hands perfectly steady. Ron looked at the decoy detonator for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, he'd have been insufferable about the 12%. "Catastrophically insufferable," George said. "He'd have claimed it was at least 30. The two of them stood with the weight of that between them and let it be there, which was the only way to carry it. On the way out, Hermione paused and looked at the placard above the door. "He's going to be all right," she said quietly. Harry said, "He's deciding to be." She looked at him. "That's what I said." 6 weeks into that summer, the trial of Dolores Jane Umbridge convened in a chamber older than the Wizengamot's main hall by 2 centuries. A room built specifically for criminal proceedings at a time when wizarding Britain still distinguished between criminal justice and administrative function with more consistency than it later managed. It had not been used for actual trials in 11 years. Hermione had spent a week reviewing its procedural history and produced a 12-page document on her findings, distributed to 4 independent ICW legal observers attending as a condition of the proceedings' international legitimacy. The central finding was unambiguous. The last 11 years of the trial chamber's use had been administrative proceedings dressed in trial language, producing legal-looking outcomes without legal standard evidence. This practice was ending. Umbridge entered under escort, wearing the expression of someone who had performed authority for so long that its removal hadn't fully registered as real, not defiance. Something more unsettling than defiance. The expression of a person who believed, below the level of conscious thought, that the correct people were not in the rooms where they currently stood. She looked at Harry when she entered. The prosecutor was Amara Osei, 16 years conducting criminal proceedings for the ICW, a woman who did not perform outrage or construct narratives of villainy. She presented evidence. She asked questions. The sequence was organized with such precision that the chamber arrived at conclusions independently, finding the prosecutor already there when they arrived. The charges: use of illegal torture instruments on minors, abuse of ministry authority for personal persecution, facilitation of blood status-based violence during the Muggle-born Registration Commission, 3 counts of unlawful detention without charge. The blood quill evidence came first. 17 written statements read into the record in Osei's neutral professional register. The register of someone who understood that evidence carrying this weight did not require amplification. Harry had read these statements the previous month in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place at 2 in the morning. He sat with them again now and let them be present in the room. One of the statements was his own, 5 detentions in his 5th year. The quill scratching words into the back of his hand in his own blood, the wound sealing and reopening each time he was required to write. He had written the account in the factual register of someone who had decided that precision was the only appropriate register for this material, and Osei read it in the same register he had written it. Umbridge's expression slipped, a fraction, involuntary, a single movement at the corners of her mouth suggesting she was encountering, at the level people cannot fully control, the experience of hearing their own actions described with complete accuracy and no framing that softened them. It recovered. But it had slipped, and Harry had seen it, and so had the EW observers. The Muggle-born Registration Commission records were the second body of evidence, 432 cases processed, each documenting interrogation, verdict, and subsequent action. 61 had resulted in imprisonment. 23 of those 61 had resulted in deaths, recorded in Azkaban's medical files as causes ranging from Dementor-related deterioration to what was described in the bureaucratic euphemism of a system that did not want to name what it was doing as adverse response to custodial conditions. Osei read 40 of the 432 records, enough to establish a pattern thoroughly. She set the 40th down. The prosecution rests on the documentation, the defense counsel said. The defendant acted within the scope of ministry policy as it existed at the time. Ministry policy does not supersede the Wizarding Convention Against Torture, ratified by Britain in 1954, Osei said, which the defendant was aware of, and which explicitly prohibits the specific practices documented in the prosecution's evidence. The convention contains no category exemption. The defendant's belief about its applicability does not alter its legal text. A witness was called after the documentation. Lee Jordan, who had run Potterwatch through the occupation and who arrived in the trial chamber wearing the precise expression of someone who had been composing what they wanted to say for 8 months. He described a specific afternoon at the height of the Carrows' administration when he had attempted to reach 3 students in Umbridge's former office through ministry channels and been blocked at every stage, not bureaucratically, but specifically, by individuals who recognized what he was trying to do and acted to prevent it. He described this without embellishment. He did not look at Umbridge. He spoke to the record. Neville, in the observers section, looked at the wall directly opposite. Harry looked at the floor, where he'd been looking for 20 minutes, which was not because he couldn't look at the witness or the defendant, but because he had found that looking at a neutral fixed point allowed him to listen with full attention rather than partial attention divided between listening and managing his own responses. After Lee Jordan stepped down, the defense counsel attempted a procedural argument about the admissibility of witness accounts predating the current ministry's formal establishment. Osei addressed the argument in 11 words that dismantled its legal basis, waited for it to be withdrawn, and then rested. The verdict took 40 minutes. Guilty on all counts. 12 years minimum under the new Azkaban conditions Kingsley was implementing. Dementor removal, structured rehabilitation, educational provision. Not comfortable, but not what it had been. Harry watched Umbridge escorted from the chamber and felt something he had not expected. Not satisfaction, not relief, but the completion of arithmetic. A correct answer arrived at. A column that balanced. Amara Osei closed her documentation folder with the precise movements of a professional finishing a piece of work. She looked across at Harry and Hermione. 9 more scheduled for the month. We'll have the Selwyn documentation to you by Thursday, Hermione said. Osei looked at her with the expression of one professional encountering another at a standard they respect. The Selwyn case involves 3 separate legal jurisdictions. 4, Hermione said. I found a property holding in France that adds a Beauxbatons educational authority dimension. Osei looked at her for a long moment. "I look forward to Thursday's documentation," she said. 2 weeks before the September term, 8 people sat in the Hogwarts staff room. McGonagall at the head, who had sent Harry and Hermione a letter in June outlining her own reform priorities, overlapping with their proposals in 11 areas, diverging in 3, approaching the divergences with the intellectual honesty of someone who distinguished between disagreeing and being wrong. Flitwick beside her, meeting everything with the particular quality of finding it interesting rather than alarming, which was his most consistent characteristic and which had under the current circumstances an immense practical value. Slughorn occupied the far end of the table with the expression of a man who had navigated institutional politics for 60 years and was attempting to read the room. Hermione presented the history of magic restructuring without preamble. 4 thematic areas, the actual history of the Goblin rebellions, including the treaty violations that caused each uprising, the history of Muggle-born magical persons in Britain from the 16th century forward, the development of wizarding law and its relationship to ministry power, comparative international magical history. One of the teachers who had covered the history slot since Binns's departure looked at the curriculum document and said, "This is considerably more political than what we've been teaching." "What we've been teaching," Hermione said, "is also political. It has been political in the service of maintaining a status quo rather than examining it. Every curriculum reflects choices about what is worth knowing. The only question is whether those choices are made consciously or by default." She looked around the table. "The version we have been teaching by default has produced 2 generations of graduates who were entirely unprepared to recognize how the society around them failed them. That is not an accidental outcome. It is the consequence of deliberate omission." The room was quiet for a moment. McGonagall said, "Accepted in principle. Implementation timing follows." Flitwick made a small sound that might have been approval. Harry addressed defense against the dark arts. "The most significant threats British wizarding society has faced in living memory did not come from darkness in the abstract. They came from specific people using specific institutional structures to commit specific abuses of power. Students who leave this school should know how to cast a shield charm. They should also know what to do if the people casting shield charms at them are ministry aurors acting on illegal orders." He let that sit for a moment before continuing. "The students who were here last year were subjected to the Cruciatus Curse by teachers as a disciplinary measure. They were children, and the institutional knowledge of what to do when that happens, how to document it, who has jurisdiction, what protections exist and how to access them, was entirely absent from anything we taught them." Slughorn opened his mouth. "Horace," McGonagall said, without looking at him. Slughorn closed it. Harry looked at Slughorn steadily. He understood what Slughorn was. Hermione had written a footnote about it in the education proposal. Dry and precise, Slughorn represents an institutional type. The collector, the networker, the teacher whose primary relationship with students is mediated by their perceived future usefulness. This type requires structural disincentive rather than individual removal. Harry thought the footnote was correct, and also thought that looking at Slughorn across a staff room table while discussing what Hogwarts had failed to teach was producing reactions he was choosing to set aside until after the meeting. "I am not proposing anything radical," he said. "I am proposing that we teach students about the world they're actually going to inhabit." Slughorn did not speak again after that. During the 3rd hour, Flitwick set down his teacup and said, quietly, "I would like to propose a subject." The room turned. Social magic. He said it with the diffidence of someone who had been holding an idea for some time and had determined this was the moment to release it. The study of how magical people relate to one another across the lines society is constructed, blood status, creature status, class, inherited magical tradition, not theoretical, practical, cross-house, cross-background collaborative work. Students assessed on their capacity to work together and to disagree productively. He looked at his hands. I have been teaching charms for decades. I find I am increasingly interested in teaching something else for at least one session per week. Last year reminded me that technical magical skill, in isolation, is not sufficient preparation for life in the world. Harry said, "Who would teach it?" Flitwick said, "I believe you are looking at him." After a pause, Harry said, "Are you sure? It would add significantly to your existing load." Flitwick said, "Charms has the advantage of being endlessly interesting and the disadvantage of being something I could teach in my sleep. This," he gestured at the curriculum proposals spread across the table, "is not something I could teach in my sleep." That is precisely the point. By September, Sirius Black was settled at Grimmauld Place, or rather, at the version of Grimmauld Place that no longer resembled what Sirius Black had grown up in and fled from. The renovation had been ongoing since June, approached with the focused energy of someone who had been imagining it from inside a prison for 12 years, and arrived with a precise vision of what it should become. What needed explaining, what the newspapers did not convey, and what Sirius rarely addressed directly, was that he should not, by all reasonable expectations, have been there to renovate anything. 2 years before the Battle of Hogwarts, at the Department of Mysteries, Sirius had fallen toward the Veil. In the chaos of that fight, Dumbledore had pulled him back, wandlessly, in the last possible instant, leaving Sirius unconscious for 3 days, injured for 6 weeks, and permanently changed in some way that expressed itself as a kind of stillness he hadn't possessed before, as if the near miss had permanently revised his relationship to the present moment. He never spoke about what he had experienced in those 3 seconds suspended at the veil's edge. Harry had never asked. What the Ministry had never done, while Sirius recovered in hiding and spent 2 more years as a fugitive, was clear his name. That changed in June. Kingsley presided over the formal exoneration in the Ministry atrium, the ICW Observer verified. Harry stood beside Sirius as the name moved from one registry to another, from convicted murderer and traitor to innocent man, wrongly imprisoned for 12 years, and did not speak, because Sirius did not need Harry's analysis of his own experience. What he needed was Harry standing there. Afterward, they walked out of the Ministry together, and Sirius stood on the pavement and looked at the street for a long time without speaking. Harry stood beside him. The silence was the right kind. The portrait of Walburga Black had been removed in August, a project requiring Hermione's identification of the specific enchantment type, 2 hours of careful counter-charm work, and 40 minutes of the portrait screaming while they worked. Sirius sat in the kitchen during those 40 minutes with tea and said nothing. When the portrait finally came off the wall and went silent, he walked into the hallway and looked at the clean plaster. He stood there a long time. Harry watched him from the kitchen doorway and thought about everything an empty wall could mean to someone who had grown up in front of a different one. In the 3rd week of September, the first photograph went up. James and Lily, moving in the silver and shadow way of wizarding photographs, laughing at something outside the frame. Then the marauders at school, all 4 of them. Then Harry and Sirius in the Ministry atrium on the day the name changed, taken by Hermione on her camera, showing both their faces at the exact moment of the exoneration. Not triumph, not relief. Something that held both and was more particular than either. The notice board grew. The accumulation of a life being built. On the morning of his first exoneration anniversary, Sirius made breakfast for everyone in the Grimmauld Place kitchen, which was, Hermione told Harry later, the first time in recorded Grimmauld Place history that the stove had been used to make something other than tea. Sirius burned the toast twice and scrambled the eggs with the focused commitment of someone who had decided that competence was available to anyone willing to practice it long enough. He put the plates on the table. He sat down. He looked at the kitchen, the absence of the portrait in the hall, the notice board visible through the doorway. The people sitting at the table he had sat at as a child and run from as a young man, and return to now, changed enough that the returning was different from anything the original leaving had led him to expect. He said, "I've been thinking about what I want to do." Ron looked up. Neville set down his fork. "I've been thinking about it for a year," Sirius said. "What I want to do with the years I have. Not in the ministry, not in the Auror office. Something mine." He looked at the notice board. "I want to document what happened. Properly. The First War. What the Order did, and what the Order got wrong, and what the people who didn't survive it should have had the chance to say." He looked at Harry. "Not as a monument, as a record, so that the people who come after it know what it cost and why and what the alternative looked like." Harry said, "Yes, it was a complete sentence. No qualification needed." Sirius looked at his eggs. "Also, the eggs need more salt," he said. "I know they need more salt. I'm choosing not to add it." Ron said, "They definitely need more salt." Hermione said, "They're very good." Ron looked at her. She looked at her plate. "They need more salt." On an evening in late September, the kitchen at Grimmauld Place held. Sirius making tea with the focused attention of someone who had decided that the ordinary domestic competencies he had never developed were worth developing now. Neville at one end of the table with his Auror training notes beside an ongoing herbology propagation experiment that had been running since August, and that he monitored with the divided professional dedication of a person pursuing two masteries simultaneously. Hermione at the other end writing at a pace suggesting she had been at it since before anyone else arrived. Ron on the floor with his back against the counter eating cold, leftover shepherd's pie from a bowl and reading a Quidditch report. "Ron," Hermione said, without looking up, "there's a perfectly functional table. There's also a perfectly functional floor," Ron said. "The floor is not, Hermione," Harry said. She looked up. He set a cup of tea in front of her. She looked at it for a moment with the expression she wore when she had been working long enough to forget she was a person who needed tea. And the reminder arrived from outside. "Thank you," she said, and went back to writing. Ron looked at Harry from the floor. Harry looked at Ron. Something passed between them that had no words and required none. The specific communication of two people who had known each other since they were 11 and had, across the intervening years, developed a conversational shorthand for, "Everything is going to be fine. Or at least we are going to be fine within it." Ron went back to his shepherd's pie. Harry went back to his case file. The kitchen held all of them in the particular warmth of a house that was becoming, incrementally, a home. The Auror case file review had begun in July. Harry was there 3 days a week in no official capacity. He had declined formal Auror training with the courtesy of someone who had thought carefully about the declination. What he was doing was documentation, reviewing inherited case files, flagging those requiring immediate reopening, building a framework for what Auror training should actually contain going forward. Sirius came in one morning in September with a folder Harry recognized by its thickness as one he had been not quite avoiding. "I went through it this morning," Sirius said, setting it on the table between them. "I wanted to see what was in it before you did. Not to change anything. Just—" He stopped. "I don't have a clean explanation for the reason." "You wanted to know what was in it before I had to look at it with you watching me look at it," Harry said. Yes, Neville, who had been working at the far end of the table, understood within 30 seconds what was happening, and found a reason to go to the adjacent office. Ron, who had come in from field training an hour earlier and fallen asleep in a chair over a procedural manual, woke up, took one look at the folder, and followed Neville. Harry pulled the folder toward him. The Pettigrew case file. The original ministry record from November 1981, Sirius's imprisonment, Peter's supposed death, the 12 Muggle casualties, every conclusion wrong. 36 pages constructed with the thoroughness of a system that had never doubted itself. Sirius's guilt stated as fact on page 2 and never revisited. Everything that followed built on a foundation that was wrong. not through individual dishonesty in every case, but through the particular failure of a system that believed itself too fully to check. Harry read to the end. He set the last page down. He sat with it for a moment. The Auror office was a utilitarian room, maps, filing, documentation on every flat surface, and it did not know how to hold this kind of silence, so it simply held it anyway. The official who processed this, he said. Barnabas Grout. Retired since 1989. Lives in Norfolk. Sirius looked at his hands on the table. He wasn't malicious. He was careless. He believed what he was told and didn't verify it, which in wartime is a process failure rather than a character one, though the distinction stopped mattering to me fairly quickly after Azkaban. Were you angry at him? Specifically at him? Sirius was quiet for a long moment. I was angry at the system, he said. Finally, Grout was a person who trusted a system that had been built to produce exactly his kind of failure. He believed it was doing its job because it looked like it was doing its job. He looked at the file. That is a different thing from malice. It is not a different thing from harm. Harry looked at the file. 12 years, he said. Yes, and nobody who processed that file ever thought to check. Nobody whose job it was to check had a structure that made checking necessary, Sirius said. That is exactly the problem. He looked at Harry directly, which is why I want to be involved in fixing it, not because I'm angry at Barnabas Grout. Because if there's no accountability structure for negligence, the next Barnabas Grout will do the same thing to the next person without understanding that they've done anything wrong. Harry opened his notebook to a clean page and wrote at the top, Ministry Official Negligence Accountability Framework. I want you involved in writing this one, he said. Sirius looked at him across the table in the afternoon light of the Auror office, which was not a room built for this kind of conversation, and was managing it anyway. Yes, he said. All right. It was Neville who found the thread that changed everything. He had not been looking for it specifically. He was conducting a routine cross-reference in the Gringotts lineage theft database, the tool Hermione had negotiated into the reform framework and which was proving to contain, as she had always suspected, considerably more than anyone had anticipated. The database tracked asset transfers, payment records, account activities stretching back generations. Neville was running names from an unrelated resistance network when a cross-reference returned a result that stopped him cold. A payment. Made monthly from the summer of 1984 to the autumn of 1996. From an account registered under a false name that resolved, after 3 hours with the Lineage Records Division, to a vault belonging to the Lestrange family. Paid to a St. Mungo's healer named Aldrich Price. Neville sat very still for a long time. Then he went to find Harry. They spent a week reconstructing what the payments had purchased. Price had been the senior healer responsible for Frank and Alice Longbottom's care since their admission in the winter of 1981. He had also, beginning in 1984, been quietly suppressing research into recovery from Cruciatus Curse neurological damage, not merely because of political inconvenience, as the story had always been told, but because he was being paid to ensure that research never reached publication. The payments covered his ongoing management of the Longbottom's palliative care and his active intervention to prevent the findings of a healer researcher from the 1970s from ever being properly reviewed. The reason Frank specifically mattered was this: before his torture, Frank Longbottom had been one of the most effective Aurors in Wizarding Britain. In the 6 months before the Longbottoms were captured, he had memorized the identities of 14 Death Eaters who had never been apprehended, who had, after Voldemort's first fall, quietly integrated back into Wizarding society and maintained respectable lives. If Frank ever recovered, those 14 names recovered with him. Bellatrix Lestrange, from inside Azkaban, had made sure he never would. She's dead now, Neville said, on the evening he and Harry finished reconstructing the full picture. He said it in the flat register of someone who had moved past the emotion to the fact itself. But Price isn't, and 14 names aren't on any petition list. Harry said, "They will be." They brought the documentation to Amara Osei on a Wednesday morning. She read it in one sitting and looked up with an expression that was not theatrical, but was not neutral either. "This is sufficient for criminal prosecution of Price on charges of willful obstruction of medical treatment resulting in prolonged suffering," she said. "It is also sufficient to reopen asset seizure proceedings against the Lestrange Vault beneficiaries currently operating under assumed legitimacy." She turned to the last page. "And it gives me 13 of the 14 names." "I'll get you the 14th, Neville said. Osei looked at him. "From?" "From my father," Neville said. The silence that followed had a specific quality. Not discomfort, not doubt. Something more like the recognition of a weight that had just been placed on a table and was being acknowledged before anyone tried to lift it. Osei said, carefully, "Mr. Longbottom, the current state of your father's recovery, he knows things," Neville said. "He's always known things." The whole point of what Bellatrix and Price did was to make sure he could never tell anyone. He looked at the documentation spread across the table between them. "He's coming back. It's slower than we want and faster than anyone expected. And when he's ready, when he knows I'm asking because it matters and not because I need him to be more recovered than he is, he'll tell me." He folded the documentation neatly and slid it back across to Osei. "I'll have it to you," he said. "Give me time." She gave him 6 weeks. He came back in 4. They brought the documentation to Amara Osei. She read it in one sitting and looked up with an expression that was not theatrical, but was not neutral either. "This is sufficient for criminal prosecution of Price on charges of willful obstruction of medical treatment resulting in prolonged suffering," she said. "It also gives me 13 of the 14 names. Their assets are seizable under the Compact's lineage theft provisions. I'll get you the 14th name," Neville said. He looked at the documentation with an expression that contained everything 14 years had made of his family, and something new, something that didn't yet have a proper name. "I'll get it from my father." Then he said, "If my father can give it." Then, after a pause, "He will." The medical reassessment of Frank and Alice Longbottom had begun in December, conducted by healer Amara Okonkwo of St. Mungo's, a specialist in permanent magical injury rehabilitation trained in Nairobi, who had spent 7 years at the hospital and who had read the suppressed 1970s research Hermione located in a footnote in a single sitting, before arriving the next day with 14 specific, rigorous questions. All of them indicated she had engaged with the material at the level it deserved. "The existing treatment is palliative," Okonkwo had said at their first meeting. "It manages the state of damage without addressing the damage's cause. The unpublished research suggests the damage is persistent, rather than permanent, a different medical category, with substantially different implications." "Why has no one acted on this before?" Hermione asked. Okonkwo looked at her steadily. "Why do you think?" Hermione said. "Because the research was discontinued when it became politically inconvenient to draw attention to the long-term consequences of Death Eater activity. And because keeping the Longbottoms incapacitated served specific interests that had the resources to ensure it continued." "Yes," Okonkwo said. "And because, as a practical matter, the Longbottoms were easier to mourn quietly than to fight for loudly. The treatment she implemented over the following months was not a cure. Okonkwo had been precise about this from the beginning, declining across every subsequent conversation to overstate what the evidence supported. What she was doing was addressing the neurological architecture around the damage, the way the mind organized itself in relation to what had been done to it. Persistent things, treated correctly, could potentially be reached. By early February, the magical signature readings had changed. Augusta came to Grimmauld Place on a Tuesday evening to deliver the news in person. She sat at the kitchen table, where Sirius was making tea, where Neville was bent over his training documents, where Hermione was writing, where Ron was eating the last of a plate of biscuits, with the focused dedication of someone who had been in the field since 6 in the morning, and she said, Alice knew Neville today. She didn't say his name, but she looked at him with the looking of someone who sees a person, not movement. Her voice was very steady, and she gave him a chewing gum wrapper. Hermione's quill stopped moving. Sirius set the teapot down. Ron looked up from the biscuits. Augusta looked at her own hands. She has been giving him chewing gum wrappers since he was very small. It was something she did. A breath. He kept every one. Neville, sitting across from Augusta, did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, She's coming back. Augusta said, Yes, she is. In early autumn of the following year, Harry and Hermione sat across a conference table in the Cabinet Office near Whitehall from Caroline Webb, 53 years old, 11 years as head of the Liaison Office. A background in international treaty negotiation and constitutional law, and proposed ending 306 years of official fiction. The Liaison Office, 12 Muggle civil servants who had known about the existence of magical Britain for their entire careers, and had spent those careers managing the specific category of government magical interaction that required coordination rather than concealment. Webb had read Hermione's written briefing the day it arrived, and requested a meeting the following morning. Harry found that walking into the Cabinet Office produced a distinct awareness of the world stripped of magical presence, the stone and carpet and fluorescent lighting vivid in their ordinariness, nothing in the air or the walls or the people moving through the corridors that suggested anything but the Muggle government going about its serious daily work. He found it clarifying. Webb met them with 2 colleagues and moved directly to the substantive question. You're proposing a transition from comprehensive concealment to selective disclosure, she said. A framework where specific categories of Muggle officials have formal knowledge of magical Britain's existence, governed by treaty rather than unilateral wizarding decision. Yes, Hermione said. 300 years of precedent were established under conditions that no longer fully apply, Hermione said. The specific threat that generated the Statute of Secrecy, organized persecution of magical persons by non-magical populations operating on frameworks that treated magic as diabolism, has not constituted a realistic threat in Britain since the mid-20th century at minimum. The ongoing justification for comprehensive concealment is institutional inertia and the political interests of wizarding families who benefit from opacity, not a current genuine assessment of risk. Webb looked at her left colleague. Her colleague made a small movement of his head. Harry said, The Muggle-born Registration Commission rounded up British citizens and subjected them to interrogation and imprisonment based on their family background. Those citizens are also British subjects. The Muggle government had no knowledge this was happening and no mechanism to intervene. A treaty creates accountability that runs in both directions. A government with formal knowledge of its magical population cannot conduct the equivalent process from the wizarding side without the other party having the standing to respond. Webb was quiet for a long moment containing real thought. The political complications of formally acknowledging are significant, Hermione said. We are not suggesting this is simple. We are suggesting the alternative, continuing to operate on the fiction that 2 communities sharing the same territory have no formal relationship, produces worse outcomes than the complications of acknowledging reality. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Webb asked sharp, specific questions. She asked about the historical record of the Liaison Office's own involvement in wizarding Muggle relations. How many incidents had been managed quietly that would not have required quiet management under a treaty framework? Hermione had the figures. Webb wrote down all of them. Toward the end of the meeting, Webb set her pen down and said, I want to ask something that isn't strictly within the scope of this meeting. Harry said, Please, based on what you have seen, not theoretically. Based on actual experience, would a treaty of this kind have prevented the Muggle-born Registration Commission? Harry considered the question with the care it deserved. Not by itself, he said. A treaty creates mechanisms. Whether those mechanisms are used depends on whether the people operating them take them seriously. The commission happened in a political environment where the ministry officials who could have resisted it were either collaborating or surviving by staying invisible. What a treaty would have done is create external accountability, a party outside that internal environment, with legal standing to raise the problem and require a response. He met her gaze. Whether that would have been sufficient depends on factors neither of us can know. Webb was quiet for a moment. That's an honest answer, she said. It's the accurate one. I'd rather give you something accurate than something more reassuring. She looked at him with the expression of someone updating an assessment. Then, she said, the working group composition. 3 from the liaison office, 3 from the Wizengamot External Relations Committee, but I would like you both present as observers at every session. Hermione said, We can arrange that. By the end, a working group. 6 months, a treaty framework to be developed and reviewed before any ratification was sought. Nothing had been committed to. Everything had been put in motion. Walking back through the building's corridors afterward, Harry said, She's going to recommend it to the Prime Minister. Not for 6 months, Hermione said. She needs to build the internal case first. But she's going to. She was writing notes during your point about accountability in both directions. She was already thinking about how to frame it. Harry said, You always notice what people write down. I find it tells you more than what they say. Mid-January of the new year, Geneva, the ICW Emergency Summit, 7 working streams across 3 days. Each stream addressed a component of what the agenda formally called post-conflict restructuring of international magical governance, which was the institutional language for the question the magical world had been failing to answer for 60 years. Why did this keep happening, and what could be done about it that hadn't already been tried and had failed? The British delegation was 8 people, Kingsley leading. Priya Kapoor, appointed External Relations Chair through the first Wizengamot election cycle in November, handling the international law dimensions with the precision of someone who had spent her career in that specific territory. 3 Gringotts representatives with observer status that Ragnarok had negotiated into the summit's terms over what Hermione later described as 14 genuinely impressive hours of procedural argument. And Harry and Hermione, who were neither delegation members nor observers in any existing category, and for whom the ICW Secretariat had created a new designation, Reform Framework Architects. Harry was 18 now, Hermione 19. 2 people who had spent 8 months rebuilding a national magical government from its legal foundations. The designation had generated extensive discussion until Ragnarok submitted a 2-page document noting that Gringotts' participation in the summit was contingent on their inclusion. The ECU accepted this with the grace of an institution that understood when a procedural argument would cost more energy than the position it was defending. Hermione's morning session, Stream 4, Prevention of Authoritarian Capture of Magical Governance Structures, was 45 minutes without notes. She had internalized the material at the level where notes would have been a step backward from what she actually knew. The British Framework document, 112 pages, written in 6 weeks, described every mechanism by which Voldemort's regime had operated within the formal structures of British magical governance rather than overthrowing them. The central argument: the problem was not that Voldemort had been powerful. The problem was that the structures had been designed in ways that made them capturable. Centralized authority, hereditary concentration of power, limited accountability mechanisms. The same features that made the ministry efficient made it susceptible to a sufficiently determined bad actor who understood the structures from the inside. The final section proposed 7 structural features that taken together made magical governance significantly more resistant to capture without making it significantly less functional, derived from 8 months of British reform, tested against the political resistance those reforms had generated, and refined through that testing. The delegate from Brazil asked about the Gringotts enforcement mechanism. The delegate from France asked whether the compact had been adversarially negotiated. The delegate from Australia asked how the resistance to the expanded franchise had been managed. Specifically, how Harry and Hermione had distinguished between principled objectors and strategic ones. The principled objectors we addressed through documentation, Harry said. The historical record of what Centaur and Merperson communities had contributed to wizarding society and what they had received in return was not a comfortable account to absorb and still maintain a principled objection to their political standing. He paused. The strategic objectors had already lost the structural position that made their objection consequential. We did the Wizengamot reconstitution before the franchise expansion vote specifically because the reconstitution changed the vote arithmetic on everything that followed. The Australian delegate wrote something in her notebook. The delegate from the French ministry raised a question about sequencing, specifically whether the Wizengamot reconstitution had been deliberately structured to precede the franchise expansion. Harry explained that it had. The hereditary seat reduction changed the vote arithmetic on everything that came after it, and they had known that from the beginning. The delegate wrote this down and then said, "In the careful register of someone raising a secondary question, how did you anticipate what the resistance would look like? The specific arguments that would be deployed against each component?" Hermione said, "We studied the historical record of every previous attempt to reform the Wizengamot's composition over the preceding century. Each attempt had failed. The documentation of how each one failed told us exactly which arguments had worked before and which mechanisms had been used to obstruct which provisions. We designed around the historical failure modes." The delegate said, "You used the record of past failures as a design document." "Yes," Hermione said. "The failures were more instructive than the successes." The delegate from Japan requested the floor and presented a formal proposal from the Mahautokoro Board of Directors, an advisory engagement request for adapting the British curriculum reform framework to the Japanese magical education context. The delegate from New Zealand made a similar request on behalf of their ministry. Then Australia, then Brazil, specifically regarding the Magical Creature Rights Charter. By the afternoon session, 4 countries had formally requested advisory engagement with the British framework. Hermione received each request with the composure of someone who had worked very hard toward an outcome and was now required to process the outcome's arrival, without allowing the processing to alter the professional register of the room. Harry watched her field the 4th request and thought about the great hall in ordinary light, and a hand placed in his, and a vow that neither of them had said aloud. He thought, this is exactly what the vow was for. Intelligence arrived in early April through Neville, who was in the lower-level ministry archive conducting an assessment when Marcus Flint made contact. Flint had chosen that window because Neville's schedule was predictable, a first-year mistake that Harry noted without criticism, since Neville had been in formal training for 8 months, and predictable scheduling was something most trainees corrected between months 6 and 12. More significant than the contact window was what Flint brought, a list of 43 names. Death Eaters or affiliated individuals who had not been captured, who had not appeared on any petition list, and who had not, according to Flint, accepted Voldemort's defeat as permanent. Flint had his reasons for coming forward. The Lestrange Vault documentation had already put 13 of the 14 names Frank Longbottom carried onto the petition list. The 14th had been provided by Frank himself to Neville on a Sunday afternoon in March, a conversation Harry heard nothing of and did not ask about. What followed was that all 14 previously untouched individuals were now in proceedings. The network had noticed. Flint had been approached about joining a resistance structure, had declined, and was now aware that the people who had approached him knew he had declined. He was frightened. He was also calculating which side offered more protection. Harry found neither of these motivations disqualifying. People acted for mixed reasons. What mattered was whether the information was accurate. Hermione assessed the list. 18 names already in their files. 25 new. 3 probable errors included either to test their response to bad intelligence or because Flint's information was genuinely incomplete. 22 almost certainly accurate. This requires working with Kingsley's Aurors, Harry said. Yes, and a decision about our role and what comes next. She set the list down. We have been building legal and institutional structures. We have not been running enforcement operations. Those are different activities with different ethical weights, and I want to be deliberate about which we are engaged in. We report to Kingsley. We advise. We don't run operations. Agreed, I wanted to say it clearly. You always want to say things clearly. I find it prevents certain kinds of problems. Ron had been pursuing Auror qualification since the previous autumn, and had, to no one's surprise and Harry's considerable private pride, proven to be exceptional at the components of the work that required reading a room faster than the room was changing. In the 3 weeks of surveillance operations that followed the Flint intelligence, Ron and Neville settled into a working dynamic that neither had anticipated. Neville's ward detection instincts and Ron's improvisational fluency fitting together as a single instrument, each compensating for what the other lacked. Harry read the field reports from the coordination center and watched the dynamic emerge across dispatches. Neville would identify a magical signature, mark the coordinates, and establish the tactical picture. Ron would improvise the approach that the tactical picture called for, frequently making decisions in real time that the briefings had not anticipated. On the 3rd week, Ron's field notes began including parenthetical clarifications, and, which struck Harry, reading them, as the most efficient possible summary of how 2 people learn to operate together under pressure. Antonin Dolohov was apprehended in the Western Highlands on a Thursday morning, in a safe house that had been used during the First War, and that Neville had identified through magical signature residue that most detection charms were calibrated to miss. 6 Aurors. Clean execution. No casualties. Neville coordinating from the exterior, Ron taking the second position through the front approach. Dolohov, who had been the network's animating force rather than its ideological anchor, taken into custody before he could act on the timeline Harry had assessed as measured in weeks rather than months. The network contracted within 2 weeks of the capture. 7 of the remaining 22 turned themselves in. The remainder were the longer problem. The surveillance continued. Luna Lovegood published the story in the Quibbler a month later, under the headline, The Secret Treaty. Britain's 2 governments had been talking, and one of them has been hiding. It was, by the standards of the Quibbler, unusually factual. Specific, sourced to 3 documents that Luna did not explain, and that Harry and Hermione spent 2 hours trying to identify, before concluding that at least one had come from someone inside the liaison office, who trusted Luna in ways nobody had anticipated. The article correctly described the treaty framework's 4-stage disclosure structure, the working group's composition, and the intended timeline. It did not describe the contents of the treaty's specific provisions, either because Luna did not know them or because she had decided not to include them, and Harry found he genuinely could not determine which was more likely. Caroline Webb's response arrived at the oversight office within the hour. It was, in the controlled register of a civil servant who had just discovered that a classified negotiation had been partially published in a periodical best known for coverage of creatures that may not exist, pointed. Hermione read it twice and said, "She's right to be angry. She's also not wrong that the Quibbler's readership is unlikely to generate the coordinated political resistance we'd be facing if this were the times. That's not the same as it not being a problem," Harry said. "No, but it may be the same as the problem containing a silver lining." She looked at the article again. Luna has started a conversation. We can either spend 6 months trying to contain it, or spend 6 months deciding what we want the conversation to say. The meeting with Webb 2 days later did not go as either side had expected. Webb arrived having spent 48 hours observing the article's reception among the segment of the public that had read it. And she came to the meeting having made a decision. Stage 4, the public acknowledgement of the treaty's existence, is currently 4 years out, she said. I am proposing we move it forward by 18 months. She looked at Hermione. The Luna Lovegood article has demonstrated 2 things. First, the public's capacity to absorb the existence of a formal magical muggle relationship is greater than our modeling assumed. Second, we have a limited window to control the framing before we lose the capacity to shape the narrative. She paused. I would rather write Stage 4 than have it written for us. Harry looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at the Quibbler. He thought, of course it was Luna. He also thought about the diagram in the first Quibbler article after Gringotts said yes. The spine, the heart, the stomach, which has been eating itself for years. Luna had understood the architecture of the project 8 months ago from the outside, organized it into a diagram, and published it for public consumption. The fact that the diagram was accurate had bothered 2 ministry officials, pleased Ragnarok, and prompted Flitwick to send a letter saying he had cut it out and put it on his office wall. And now she had broken the treaty story 6 months early, and in doing so had handed them a crisis that was also, possibly, an accelerated opportunity. He thought, she has been helpful in stranger ways than this. The Muggle-born Reparations Tribunal opened in November of the first year, and began receiving claims in earnest by the second. The first claimant was a woman named Mary Abercrombie, graduated from Hogwarts with marks that were, by any objective standard, exceptional, had applied to 6 ministry departments in 1986, been rejected from all 6 at the final stage interview stage after her blood status was identified, and had spent the following 12 years working in a Muggle library. Not because she preferred it, because every door into wizarding professional life had been closed with a particular closure, polite, regretful, and devoid of any stated reason that would have given her grounds to challenge it. She brought 3 pages of documentation. She brought her Hogwarts academic records. She brought the rejection letters. She had kept them all, which told Harry something about the long, patient certainty with which she had understood that what was being done to her was wrong, and that the wrongness would eventually be addressable. She presented her claim with the composure of someone who had been waiting a very long time to be in this specific room. The tribunal's deliberation took 20 minutes. The award was full compensation for documented lost income, plus a formal ministry acknowledgement drafted by Hermione, specific and unambiguous, that the rejections had been discriminatory, and that the discrimination had been systematic rather than individual. Mary Abercrombie received the acknowledgement across the table. She read it twice. She set it down with care. She said, Is this the kind of thing that will happen again? Hermione said, We have built structural mechanisms to prevent it. Whether those mechanisms are sufficient depends on how consistently they are applied and defended going forward. A pause. That answer is less reassuring than you'd like. It's honest, Mary Abercrombie said. Yes, we've been trying to be that. Mary Abercrombie looked at the acknowledgement on the table in front of her. She picked it up and read it again, more slowly the second time, not checking, just being with it. I applied for those positions with better marks than most of the candidates who were accepted, she said. I knew it at the time. I had seen the results posted in the Hogwarts common room. I knew exactly how I compared. She folded the acknowledgement with the care of someone who intended to keep it. The worst part wasn't the rejection. It was the certainty that I was not allowed to say what had happened, because saying it would mark me as difficult, as someone who made trouble. They had built a system where the people it harmed couldn't name the harm without being punished for the naming. Hermione said, Yes, that's precisely how it was designed to work. And you named it anyway. We named it in a room where the naming had legal force, Hermione said. That is a different thing from simply naming it. The room matters. Mary Abercrombie stood. She tucked the acknowledgement into her folder and looked at both of them. At Harry, in the observers section, at Hermione across the tribunal table. She said, "Will there be more rooms like this one?" Harry said, "There will be. We're building them." She nodded, once, with the gravity of someone who understood what the building required, and was choosing to believe it was happening. By December, the tribunal had heard 47 claims. The case officers who managed intake began noting a pattern in the documentation style of certain claimants, the quality of paperwork kept by people who had understood, at the time the injustice was occurring, that they might one day need to prove it, and had organized their evidence accordingly. Not from bitterness, from a long, patient faith that there would eventually be a room where the records mattered. Hermione built the room. She put the records in it. Later that year, Mary Abercrombie joined the tribunal as its senior casework coordinator. Her letter of acceptance contained one sentence that Harry read 3 times. "I have spent 12 years knowing exactly what kind of room was needed. I would like to help run it." The day Frank Longbottom gave Neville the 14th name, Augusta came to Grimmauld Place at 9 in the evening and stood in the hallway for a moment before coming into the kitchen, which was an unusual thing for her to do. Augusta Longbottom did not hesitate in hallways. She sat at the table and said, "He remembered it correctly. I checked it against the Order of the Phoenix records Dumbledore kept." She set a piece of paper on the table. He also remembered 2 additional names that weren't in the original count, which he says he memorized separately because he didn't trust the official record to be accurate. She paused. He was right not to trust it. Harry looked at the paper. 16 names. Augusta said, "He wants to know what happens next." She looked at Harry. "He understands enough of what's happening, of what you've built, to want to know where this fits in it. He is not asking for a report. He is asking because it matters to him that the information is used rather than filed." Harry said, "It's going in front of Amara Osei by Friday. It will be in proceedings by the end of the month. All 16. Augusta looked at him. "Tell him," she said, "that it was worth remembering." On a Sunday afternoon in the 2nd year after the battle, Neville had lunch with his parents. This was a sentence that had taken a long time to become ordinary, and Neville still said it with the care of someone who understood that ordinariness was not something to take for granted. Frank and Alice Longbottom had been discharged from St. Mungo's the previous January. Not fully recovered in the conventional sense, but functionally so in the way that mattered. Present. Recognizing the people they loved. Inhabiting their daily lives. Frank had opinions about fishing. Specific, detailed, unyielding opinions about water temperature and time of day, and the character failings of fish who declined the bait. He also had opinions about how Neville held the rod, expressed with the patient repetition of a man who believed the right technique, demonstrated enough times, would eventually take hold. Neville was letting him believe it. On the 14th names, all 14 had been added to the petition list. Price had been charged. 3 of the 14 had turned themselves in when they discovered they were no longer safely anonymous. The others were in proceedings. Amara Okonkwo's treatment protocol had been published in the Journal of Magical Medicine and cited, within 4 months, in clinical correspondence from 6 other countries. She was no longer working on the Longbottoms case alone. On the last Sunday of October, Frank Longbottom looked across the kitchen table at his son and said, "You've grown up." Neville said, "You've been away a while." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then, "Tell me what I've missed." Neville said, "That might take some time." Frank said, "I've got time." 5 years to the day after the battle, a Thursday in May found Harry at the reformed Wizengamot building for the quarterly governance review. The building had changed, not structurally but atmospherically, the way institutions change when the people inside them take them seriously in a different way than before. The Centaur delegates had substantive positions on 3 agenda items this quarter and changed the outcomes on 2 of them. Priya Kapoor was writing a report. The Fountain of Magical Brethren had been removed from the Ministry Atrium the previous autumn by Wizengamot Resolution 47-12 and replaced with a commissioned piece by a goblin sculptor. It had no central figure. It was an arrangement of equal presences, each distinct, none dominant. The review ran 3 hours. That evening, 7 people gathered at a restaurant in Diagon Alley where Harry and Hermione's preferred table was available without reservation, the back corner, clear view of the room. The arrangement that came naturally to people who had spent time in situations where situational awareness was survival and had never fully stopped. Sirius was there first. This was no longer unusual. The man who had operated throughout Harry's early knowledge of him on a loose, approximate relationship to punctuality had become, without ceremony or comment, the one who arrived early. He said once that he'd spent enough of his life waiting that he'd grown impatient with delay. Harry believed him. Neville arrived in his Auror robes, straight from a late shift. He sat, looked at the table and said, "What year is it?" 5, Harry said. Neville accepted the tea the server brought without being asked. They knew his habits. "How's Frank?" "He caught a fish last week," Sirius said. He sent Neville an owl about it at 6 in the morning. "He was extremely excited," Neville said. "The fish was not large. The excitement was large." Ron arrived 20 minutes later with Ginny, whose professional Quidditch schedule made her rare at dinners, and whose presence produced a warmth in the room that reminded Harry of things he had needed reminding of during the worst of the past 5 years. She had signed her first professional Quidditch contract in October of the first year, and had spent the 4 years since becoming one of the best chasers in the Holyhead Harpies' current roster, which she reported on with the particular combination of satisfaction and continued ambition that characterized her approach to everything she decided to be good at. She looked at the assembled table and said, "What did I miss?" Harry said 5, Ron told her. 5, she repeated, looking at Harry with the expression she wore when she was making sure something was real. 5 years. 5 years, Harry said. Hermione arrived at 7:30 with her notebook and the look of someone who had spent the afternoon in the Treaty Oversight Office managing an unexpected scheduling conflict that she had resolved by the time she sat down. She looked at all of them, Sirius, Neville, Ron, Ginny, Harry, and something in her expression shifted into the quality it held only in moments when the work stopped. Just briefly, and she was simply present in a room full of people she loved. "What did I miss?" she said. "Nothing," said everyone, at almost the same time. The dinner moved through 2 hours easily, the governance review's quarterly findings, Neville's current case in the careful terms he was permitted to share, Ginny's assessment of the Harpies' season prospects, which she described as excellent unless Simone Parrish stays healthy, in which case ambitious, Sirius and Ron's ongoing disagreement about the correct approach to enchanted chess that had been running since September, the state of Diagon Alley 5 years on. George's shop had expanded into the property next door, a development Ron reported with the particular satisfaction of someone who had watched his brother decide to be all right and found the watching rewarding. Luna Lovegood's most recent Quibbler article, which Ginny described as technically accurate this time, which is somehow more unsettling than the Nargles. She was right about the treaty 12 months before we were allowed to confirm it, Harry said. She is, Sirius said, almost always right about the things that matter, in a way that makes it impossible to predict when she'll be wrong about the things that don't. Ron said, the Nargles are real, according to her. Sirius said, I spent 12 years in Azkaban. I am no longer the person to tell someone their unusual beliefs about the invisible world are definitely wrong. A pause moved around the table. Then Neville said, fair. And somehow that was the end of the conversation and the beginning of a different one. The kind that happened when people who had been through difficult things together reached the part of the evening where the difficult things could be named without ceremony and set down again without ceremony. Because they had been carrying them long enough that carrying was no longer the default state. At 9, Hermione excused herself for 20 minutes to respond to a message from Caroline Webb about the Stage 3 disclosure calendar. Harry watched her go. Sirius watched Harry watch her go. Then Sirius looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had been deciding whether to say something for 3 hours. Harry said, "Just say it." "I wasn't going to. You've been deciding since we sat down." Sirius looked at the table, then at Harry. "It's been 5 years," he said. "I know. I'm merely noting that 5 years is a considerable period, Sirius, I'm noting." "You are not merely noting." Neville developed an intense interest in his tea. Ron looked at the ceiling. Ginny looked directly at Harry with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and amusement. Harry said, "I have a plan." Sirius said, "You have a plan. A specific plan. A specific evening. Approximately 2 weeks from now." Neville looked up from his tea. "Does she know?" "She knows approximately 90% of everything I think," Harry said. "She does not know this specific thing." He paused. "I think." Ginny said, "The woman who designed the Treaty Oversight Accountability Framework may have inferred your specific plan." Harry said, "Possibly 2 weeks," Sirius said. 2 weeks, Harry confirmed. Hermione came back at 9:20. She looked at the table, at Sirius's careful neutrality, Neville's studied interest in his tea, Ron's performance of innocence, Ginny's expression that had given up on pretending, and arrived at a conclusion she was clearly choosing not to articulate. She sat down. She looked at Harry with the expression she wore when she had inferred something and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He said, "How was the message?" "Stage 3 disclosure calendar has a conflict in October. I've sent Webb a proposed solution." She picked up her wine. "How was the governance review?" "The Centaur delegates changed 2 outcomes. Priya is writing a report. I'll read it tomorrow. I know you will." Later, they walked out into Diagon Alley. The street at 10:30 had the feel of a place settling at the end of a long day. Shops mostly dark. The remaining foot traffic purposeful rather than wandering. The cobblestones holding the warmth of a late spring evening that was finally releasing it into the air. The street lamps burned steady and warm above the old stone facades. They had been walking here together for 9 years. 8 of those years had been something. The last 5 had been specifically this. The pace they walked at was the pace they had always walked at, found through proximity when they were 11 years old and maintained ever since, because it had never needed adjustment. Harry said, "Do you know what day it is?" 2nd of May, she said. 5 years. 5 years. She was quiet for a moment. Not the working quiet, not the problem-solving quiet, the one she carried when she was simply in a moment without anything to solve. "We rebuilt it. We're rebuilding it," Harry said. "It's not finished. It won't be finished." She looked at the alley around her, the lit cobblestones, the chimneys against the clear night sky, the 300 years of this street that would outlast them both. That's not the same as not having done something real. No, it isn't. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked at him with the expression that was not any of her working expressions, not documentation or analysis or problem-solving, the one that existed beneath all of those, produced when she was not performing any function but simply standing in the world as herself. "It was worth it," she said. "Yes, all of it, even the parts that were difficult, especially those." She held his gaze. "What's next?" Stage 3 disclosure in October. The second Muggle-born cohort through the Reparations Tribunal. The Centaur Accords review. Priya's proposal on the Wizengamot election cycle. He paused. "A specific evening in approximately 2 weeks." She said, "A specific evening." "Yes." She looked at him with the expression that confirmed she had inferred approximately 90% of what that evening would contain. She said, "All right, all right?" "Yes," she began walking again. Come on, there's work tomorrow. He walked beside her. The alley held them in its lamplight, and the May evening held the city in its warmth. And Wizarding Britain was 5 years into becoming something different from what it had been. Not finished, not perfect, and never going to be either. Which was not the point. The point was that it was real, and they had made it so, and the making was ongoing, and they were going to walk it together. She already had the notebook out. He did not suggest she put it away. 2 weeks later, on a Friday evening in late May, Harry took Hermione to the shore of the Hogwarts lake, the particular stretch of it that looked west across the water, where in the early years they had studied and argued, and in the later years had talked about what needed doing next, and where the light now fell in long gold bars across the surface. He did not make a speech. He had considered one and concluded that a speech was not the right register for this specific moment with this specific person. He said, "I have been thinking about this since January." She said, "I know." He said, "I have a specific plan." She said, "I know that too." He looked at her. She looked at him. The lake was doing what the lake always did, holding the light without comment, indifferent to the significance of what was happening on its shore. He said, "Hermione, will you?" She said, "Yes." He stopped. "I hadn't finished." "I know," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "You inferred the plan." "I inferred the plan in January," she said. "I have been waiting for the specific evening since then." He said, "That is very me," she agreed. He laughed. She laughed. The lake held the evening light without comment. He had a ring, 3 weeks in the choosing, which she told him afterward she had also inferred because he had gone to Diagon Alley 3 times in March without her, and returned looking as though he had been concentrating very hard on something he was not going to explain. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a long moment, the way she looked at things she intended to keep permanently. She said, "We should add the wedding to the calendar." He said, "We should add it after the Stage 3 disclosure." She said, "Obviously," but soon after. He said, "Obviously." She looked at the lake. "We sat out here once," she said, in the 3rd year. "You had been worrying about the Dementors, and I had been worrying about the Time Turner schedule, and we sat here because there was nowhere else that didn't have something in it, requiring something from us." Harry said, "You were reading 3 books at once. I was reading 2 books and using the 3rd as a shelf for my notes." She looked at him. "You had fallen asleep by the time I finished. You were reading for 4 hours. 2.5. It felt like 4. Because you were asleep." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about that afternoon occasionally, across the last 5 years, about what it would have meant to the person sitting there, 13 years old, genuinely frightened, working harder than anyone around her knew, if you could have told her what was coming." Harry said she wouldn't have believed it. No, she would have wanted to. But the size of it, the possibility that the work would matter, that the world could be changed, that she would be here, this evening, by this lake, she wouldn't have had the framework for it yet. She looked at the ring. "I'm glad she kept working anyway." Harry said, "So am I." The lake was still. The light was gold and going. The world they had built, in courtrooms and offices, and the Wizengamot chamber, and the cabinet office, and the Gringotts founder's suite, and all the ordinary kitchens and corridors where the patient, unglamorous work of making things right had taken place, continued its patient work without them for the moment. It could do that now. They had built it too. The next thing was always waiting. They had always walked toward it. She took his hand. They stood at the edge of the water, and the evening held them in its warmth, and there was work tomorrow, and it was enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.